Chapter 1. For those who've come across the seas. We've boundless plains to share. Advance Australia Fair, Peter Dodds McCormick, 1878. The very late Captain Cook. It is the 29th of April 1770, and Captain James Cook, the greatest explorer of his age, he was 42, strides across the deck of the HMS Endeavour while his pet botanist Joseph Banks scurries in his wake wittering on about seed pods. But Cook only has ears for the siren song of the land that lies spread before him like a welcoming lover. He has discovered her and all her secrets, and this day at Botany Bay he will name her and claim her for God, King and Great Britain. This is, of course, complete nonsense. Captain Cook wasn't even Captain Cook in 1770, but Lieutenant Cook, a junior officer of no particular note. He arrived between 60,000 and 164 years too late to discover Australia, depending on whom you listen to, and claimed the continent's entire east coast, which he didn't like much, on Possession Island in the Torres Strait, naming it New Wales because it reminded him very much of sunny tropical Wales. Cook added the south bit later. New South Wales just had a better ring to it. By the time Cook got around to not discovering Australia, Spanish eyes had gazed upon her emerald rainforests, a Dutch psychopath had bathed her beaches in the blood of his countrymen, and her northern shores had serviced China's sexually adventurous and erectilely challenged for at least half a century. So what of those who came across the sea before Cook? They certainly didn't tell of boundless plains to share. The general consensus was that Australia was sandy, boring, and full of hostile savages who weren't interested in buying tea. The first Englishman not to discover Australia. Cook wasn't even the first Englishman not to discover Australia. That honour fell to the murderously incompetent Captain John Brooks in 1622. Brooks was one of the first children of a new golden age in which the English dreamt of empire. King James VI of Scotland had ascended the English throne in 1603, joining the two previously hostile countries together under a common monarch and changing his name to King James I. The Irish were crushed in the same year, after 60 years of war and an even longer period of jokes at their expense. The English jackboot had already trampled the Welsh daffodil and the much hardier leek, and with Scotland and Ireland now subdued, a truly Great Britain was looking to make her mark on the wider world. Britain's first permanent colony was established in 1607, and when the Mayflower Pilgrims went to starve and freeze in America in 1620, Britain was well on her way to becoming a great colonial power. The British were delightfully impractical colonists. The Mayflower didn't carry fripperies like seeds or livestock, but one of its passengers, William Mullins, thoughtfully packed 139 pairs of shoes to starve in. But in 1622, Britannia did not yet rule the waves, with the Spanish, Dutch and French fleets challenging her naval supremacy. And while Great Britain is now a nation of shopkeepers, back then if Brooks wanted to buy a really good cheese, tulip, painting of a chubby nude chick with red hair, or most importantly, the latest must-have condiment, he would have had to ask the Dutch. Europe had discovered that its traditional cuisine of turnip and lard was actually edible when heavily disguised with spices. Pepper was all the rage, the landed gentry held nutmeg parties, and gold was worth its weight in cloves. Most of these exotic treats could only be found in the East Indies, now Indonesia, and the Dutch East India Company held the keys to the spice rack. And so it is we find Captain Brooks of the Trial skulking off the northwest cape of Western Australia, en route to the East Indies, his hold full of silver to buy pepper from under the noses of the Dutch. In fairness to Captain Cook, he knew he had run into Australia, or New Holland as it was then known. Brooks had no idea. When Brooks sighted the Australian coast, he thought it a small island in the Indian Ocean. This was his first navigational mistake. His second was to run his ship into a small island in the Indian Ocean, which he thought to be open sea. The low-lying island, now known as Trial Rocks, lies about 100 kilometres off the West Australian coast and is the site of the first proven European shipwreck in Australian waters. Historians spend a lot of time doing useful things, like debating the meaning of the word discovery. The consensus is that running into something without realising where it is does not constitute discovery, although this rule is not applied to Christopher Columbus, who maintained until his dying day that he had crashed into Asia and that America did not exist. Columbus was also one of history's most inept spice traders. The overrated mariner, incorrectly believing himself to be in Asia, painstakingly scraped away at some West Indian trees that he incorrectly believed to be cinnamon. When he arrived back in Spain, he proudly showed off his cargo of useless bark. Another rule of discovery is that you must leave X, find Y, and then return to X and announce, "I have just found Y." You can't stay in Y being hand-fed papaya by the 60 Polynesian virgins who have declared you to be a living god. So Brooks saw Australia, Brooks crashed into Australia, but Brooks did not discover Australia. Brooks also did not discover Australia because the Dutch and a whole lot of other people got there before him. Brooks was not the sort of captain to go down with his ship. He was, however, the sort of captain to make off with its silver, while his men drowned around him. Brooks and 45 of his crew escaped in the ship's longboat and skiff, which had room for many more men, leaving 93 of their fellows to succumb to hunger, thirst and high tide. He made it to Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and told his employer, the British East India Company, that all its silver was lying at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. He promised that he had stuck to his alligated course and had been nowhere near the waters in which he had sunk. For centuries, seamen searched the wrong seas for the trial's treasure. Only in 1969 was the wreck discovered and the first sighting of Australia by an Englishman confirmed. The first English backpacker. The next Englishman not to discover Australia was William Dampier. Dampier was England's first professional tourist and clocked up a phenomenal quantity of frequent sailor points, being the first man to circumnavigate the globe 3 times. Dampier was also a pirate, but he was a sensitive pirate with soulful eyes and long girly hair, who kept a diary in which he recorded his feelings about the many lands, people, plants and animals he encountered. Dampier's pirating gave him an opportunity to see the world and kill all sorts of new and interesting people, although, in his defence, he felt bad about it afterwards, unless his victims were Spanish. The pirates of the Caribbean, of which Dampier was one, had many endearing qualities. They revived the democracy of the ancient Greeks, with crew members electing their captain and voting on where to travel and whom to kill. After an honest day's raping and pillaging, they would divide the day's spoils equally. They introduced the world's first workers' compensation scheme, with payouts determined by battle wound severity. The generous compensation scheme enabled maimed pirates to buy wooden legs, fitted hooks, eye patches, etc. There is no historical evidence of a parrot allowance. On the island of Tortuga, buccaneers lived in lifelong male pairs. Partners were known as matelots, and they did, sharing property, food, a bed, and in every sense of the word, each other's booty. The English turned a blind eye to this bohemian lifestyle because the pirates were awfully good at burning Spanish towns, sinking Spanish ships, and hanging Spanish sailors from the yardarm by their entrails, all of which the English regarded as jolly good sport. So in 1688 we find William Dampier pirating off the Mexican coast aboard Captain Swan's Signet. The Little Swan. This is an example of pirate humour. Swan was tired of killing Spaniards in the Americas and suggested to his crew that they might like to kill some different Spaniards in the Philippines. Dampier wrote that the crew of the Signet only had 3 days' worth of rations by the time they reached Guam, and had contrived to kill Captain Swan and eat him when the victuals were gone. Although Swan escaped undevoured, the Signet's Asian booty was restricted to rice and cotton, a far cry from the gold and silver of the Americas. The Signet was now being hunted by the Spanish, and the crew voted to lie low in New Holland for a while on the grounds that everyone said the place was a dump. No one in their right mind could think the English would ever go there. And so, on 4 January 1688, Dampier landed on the coast of Western Australia. This was actually 4 January 1689 under the modern calendar. Until 1752, the English celebrated New Year's Day on 25 March, the day Mary conceived Jesus, Ladies' Day. When the English adopted the Gregorian calendar, they celebrated New Year's Day on 1 January, the day Jesus was circumcised. Small Screaming Boys' Day. Dampier's diary from his short stay shows that, like many Englishmen abroad, he didn't like the climate, the people, or the food. He wrote,
"The inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the world. The Hodmadods of Monomatapa, though a nasty people, yet for wealth a gentleman to these, who have no houses and skin garments, sheep, poultry, and fruits of the earth, ostrich eggs, etc., as the Hodmadods have. And setting aside their human shape, they differ but little from brutes. They are long-visaged, and of a very unpleasant aspect, having not one graceful feature in their faces."
After getting Anglo-Aboriginal relations off to such a promising start, Dampier left our shores, bought a tattooed East Indian slave named Jolie, returned to England, sold Jolie to a travelling freak show, and published the diary of his travels. A New Voyage Around the World was, with the exception of the Bible, the most popular book of its era. Part 17th century Lonely Planet Guide, part swashbuckling potboiler. Dampier could move seamlessly from a botanical description of the banana to a dissertation on the sexual mores of Filipino women before launching into tales of rapine upon the high seas and enumerating the many failings of the various foreigners he had met and killed. Dampier wrote about bananas a lot. He believed the banana to be
"the king of all fruit,"
rating the plantain slightly above the dessert banana. Dampier traded off his literary success and came up with a new daring plan. He would join the Royal Navy and go not discover Australia again. The voyage was a disaster. His ship, the Roebuck, leaked and to the horror of its sodden sailors, ran out of beer. By the time the Roebuck arrived in Western Australia, her crew were losing their teeth to scurvy and had nominated Dampier Mr. World's Worst Captain 1699. Scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency, with symptoms including blackened skin, swollen and bleeding gums, tooth loss, extremely bad breath, uncontrollable crying, and dropping dead in agony. It commonly affected sailors who were deprived of fresh food on long sea voyages, with as many as 2 million seamen dying from the disease between 1500 and 1850 AD. Dampier again damned Australia with faint praise.
"If it were not for the sort of pleasure which results from the discovery of even the barrenest spot upon the globe, the coast of New Holland would not have charmed me much."
Dampier averted mutiny by agreeing to take his disgruntled crew home, abandoning his mission just 100 miles from Australia's east coast. Dampier's voyage to New Holland was another literary success and ensured continued English interest in the continent. His description of Australia's unpleasant wildlife — he disliked all the sharks and snakes and declared the shingleback lizard the ugliest creature he had ever seen — would inspire a future generation of naturalists, including Sir Joseph Banks and Charles Darwin. Yet Dampier's most lasting contribution has been to literature in the English language. His voyage inspired Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and the desert island abandonment of Alexander Selkirk, one of his sailing companions, was the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. In Gulliver's Travels, Swift wrote that the country of Lilliput was to the northwest of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. This explains why South Australians are shorter than other Australians. Dampier's writings introduced albatross, avocado, breadfruit, cashew, chopsticks, dildo bush, possum, subspecies and tortilla into the English vocabulary. Strangely, dildo bush, Dampier's name for a suggestively shaped Caribbean cactus, has never really taken off. Dampier did not introduce the word dildo into the English lexicon, this honour being claimed by Shakespeare in A Winter's Tale. William Dampier is undoubtedly one of the greatest Englishmen never to have discovered Australia. Make love, not landfall. While English exploration was motivated by dreams of empire, the French came to the southern seas as an intellectual exercise. The mathematician and philosopher Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis suggested 12 projects for the French advancement of human knowledge, one of which was the exploration of the southern hemisphere. The French believed they had been chosen by destiny to reveal great new southern lands to an awestruck world, fire the spark of civilization in the noble savage's breast, and make wild, passionate love to women who had never before experienced the intoxicating scent of garlic laced with stale jetons. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, inspired by de Maupetit, explored the South Pacific in 1766 during his effort to become the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe. It was hoped that the voyage would restore the honour of glorious France, which had ended the 7 Years' War with yet another demonstration of its unrivalled expertise in surrendering. This was also the first voyage of discovery to carry a cargo of le geeks to methodically probe small furry animals and collect interesting rocks. Among these men of learning were the botanist Philibert Commerson, who sucked up to his boss by naming the Bougainvillea, and Jean Bart, his boyish assistant and frequent below-decks companion. In 1767, de Bougainville named Tahiti Nouvelle Kythera, after the island of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. Describing Tahiti in his steamy Voyage autour du monde, Bougainville offered a vision of an earthly paradise where men were men and women were easy, inspiring generations of French intellectuals, artists and perverts to pack their bags for Polynesia. While the French thought they knew about women, the Tahitians got one up on them. As soon as they met Jean Bart, they burst out laughing and identified him as Jean Bart. Commerson had packed his mistress, and this arrangement had gone unnoticed for over 4 months. Jean became the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, although those who like to belittle female achievement point out that she did half of it as a man. Other French explorers adopted Commerson's tactics. For example, Louis de Freycinet dressed his wife as a man and smuggled her aboard his voyage to Australia in 1817. He then needed 17 men, real ones, to guard her virtue from the crew, who had not so thoughtfully packed for 3 years at sea. Rose de Freycinet, like Jean Bart, went on to circumnavigate the globe. After leaving Tahiti, Bougainville discovered Samoa, which had earlier been discovered by the Dutch, and Vanuatu, which had earlier been discovered by the Spanish. Bougainville then searched for the mythical Terra Australis. Everyone else called it Terra Australis, but the French refused to speak anything other than French. Bougainville, during his search for the great undiscovered South Land, came within sight of the Great Barrier Reef, leading some die-hard French nationalists to claim that the French discovered the east coast of Australia. However, the truth is that Bougainville, when confronted by the reef, responded in typical French fashion. He ran away. Is that a slug in your pocket? For centuries, Macassan traders from the Indonesian island of Sulawesi had been harvesting sea cucumbers, trepang, on the North Australian coast. The sea cucumber's value lay in it being prized by the Chinese as an aphrodisiac. The sea cucumber appears an odd choice of marital aid, as it is not remotely sexy, except perhaps to another sea cucumber. It is a large, black, slug-like creature that spends its entire life sitting in shallow water, aspiring to nothing more than avoiding ending up in a Beijing sex shop. The Macassans were the first non-Aboriginal people to settle in Australia for any length of time, with up to 40 ships and over 1,000 men coming to northern Australia each trepang season. Macassan divers would collect tons of the Viagra slugs and deliver them to demountable factories on shore, where they would be boiled, dried, buried in sand for 3 weeks, dug up, boiled again, and then smoked. Listeners who think this sounds erotic are encouraged to take a cold shower and seek professional help. The Macassans had a profound impact on the culture, language and economies of the Yolngu of Arnhem Land and other Aboriginal people they encountered. For example, the Yolngu called the white people they had never seen before Balanda, a corruption of Hollander. The Macassans exchanged cloth, tobacco, knives, rice and alcohol for the right to harvest trepang and hire local labour, the earliest record of trade between Aborigines and the outside world. Indonesian fishermen have been coming to Australia in search of trepang and other less sexy sea life for centuries. Now we burn their boats. This is called progress. The land that God passed by. The Spanish would certainly have colonised Australia had they bothered to land there. As it was, they were too busy avoiding the cannibals to the north, who showed no interest in being redeemed for Christ and altogether too much interest in using Spanish skulls as novelty table ornaments. On 3 October 1606, Luis Vaz de Torres was sailing through the strait that now bears his name. If Torres had taken the time to check out the land visible a few miles to the south, his countryman, Juan Antonio Samaranch, would never have had cause to mispronounce, "And the winner is Sydney." Sydney would have instead been named Santa Kylie or San Wazza, and its residents would now be taking regular afternoon naps. The Spanish, the world's preeminent imperialists, had 3 interests in exploring the South Seas: discovering Terra Australis Incognita, discovering gold and silver, and discovering New Catholics. The New Catholics were generally unwilling to be discovered, but embraced their new religion when given the choice between kissing a cross and being nailed to it by a Spaniard. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown South Land, was invented by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Pythagoras, who is still hated by school kids for making triangles more complex than they need to be, had earlier determined that the Earth was spherical. Aristotle took Pythagoras' idea and ran with it. He knew there was a lot of land in the northern hemisphere and reasoned that there must be a similar amount of it in the undiscovered south to prevent the globe from tipping over. Aristotle had just brilliantly demonstrated that logic is a very dangerous thing. In about 150 AD, the Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy popularised Aristotle's vision by drawing a map of the world, complete with a big lumpy southern continent that he'd completely made up. Ptolemy, in putting pen to papyrus, had made Terra Australis real in the minds of future explorers. In 1567, the Viceroy of Peru commissioned Alvaro de Mandana to discover Terra Australis, find its gold and convert its resident heathens. Australia narrowly avoided dancing to a flamenco beat when Mandana rejected his navigator's proposed route, which would have intersected eastern Australia. Mandana instead discovered the Solomon Islands, but failed to discover any New Catholics after offending the locals through his refusal to eat a quarter of a boy with the arm and hand. Mandana returned to the Pacific in 1595. His trip inspired his young Portuguese pilot, Pedro Fernandes de Quiros, to mount an expedition. De Quiros was convinced Terra Australis existed, and he was terrified that it would be discovered by the Muslims of the East Indies or the Protestant English, condemning the Terra Australians to an eternity of damnation. De Quiros believed he had been chosen by God to bring Catholicism to Terra Australis, and hung about on Pope Clement VIII's doorstep making a nuisance of himself until the Pope agreed to his mission. De Quiros' 2 ships, both of which were named the San Pedro, set sail in 1605. The first few days were fun. Everybody got drunk to celebrate the feasts of Christmas, the circumcision and the Epiphany. The Epiphany celebrates the coming of the 3 wise men, irresponsibly bearing gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh, all of which are choking or poison hazards for small children. But the good times soon stopped rolling. The Pedros, the second of which was captained by Torres, carried a human cargo who would never have mixed socially on the streets of Seville. The common sailors were forced to hang out with the useless nobility, most of whom were granted lucrative stipends for irrelevant jobs. There was the ship's poet, the cosmographer, there to explain the universe, and numerous would-be ambassadors for as yet undiscovered lands. The entretenidos, gentlemen of minor means, loafed around waiting for the expedition to find treasure. Then there were the lowest of the low, cabin boys kidnapped from Spanish beaches and slaves kidnapped from Africa. And finally, the Franciscan friars, who promised salvation to the heathen and damnation to any sailor tardy in fetching their slippers. De Quiros enraged his sailors by putting them in irons for blasphemy and throwing their gaming tables overboard. He appalled the Pedro's Spanish officers by being Portuguese. He antagonised the Entretenidos by promising as much silver and gold as you can carry, and such quantity of pearls as you shall measure them by hatfuls, and delivering only coconuts. And he pissed off the Franciscans when he discovered La Australia del Espiritu Santo, now known as Vanuatu, and established a new crusading order of the Holy Ghost to convert the natives. He made all the crew holy knights, including the 2 African cooks, and insisted that the Franciscans renounce their order for his. De Queiroz named the new land La Australia, after Austria, as the Spanish royal family were the Habsburgs of Austria, not, as is commonly recounted, Australia after Terra Australis. Australians still get upset when geographically challenged foreigners, usually Americans, mistake them for Austrians. De Queiroz declared that he would build a new Jerusalem out of marble and gold on Vanuatu, and claimed for King Philip III, Jesus Christ and the Pope, "All the islands and lands I have newly discovered and desire to discover as far as the South Pole." Other nations protested that it was unfair to claim land that you merely hoped to discover, but Spain used this new doctrine of aspirational discovery to justify its claim over the South Pacific for the next century. De Queiroz would tell anybody who listened that the tiny island he had found was the vast continent of Terra Australis, now Cognita. Torres, who had sailed around it, would quietly point out that this was nonsense. When Torres and De Queiroz were separated by a storm after leaving Vanuatu, De Queiroz, faced with a mutinous crew, barricaded himself in his cabin for 3 months and returned to the Americas. Torres continued the search for Terra Australis and came within a well-oiled whisker of landing at Cape York. New Holland welcomes careful sailors. By the end of the first decade of the 17th century, the world's spice trade was controlled by the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, mercifully abbreviated to the VOC. The VOC was the first company in the world to issue shares and was almost a nation in itself, having been granted the power to form colonies, negotiate treaties, coin money and kill people for pepper. On 26 February 1606, just months before Torres encountered the Torres Strait, VOC Captain Willem Janszoon landed the Dufken near present-day Weipa on the Cape York Peninsula. He named the new land Nova Guinea and distinguished it from New Guinea, which he called Ospapua. To further complicate things, he named part of Ospapua New Zealand. Janszoon soon sailed home in a state of geographical confusion, but not before setting the template for many future contacts between Europeans and Aboriginal people. While Janszoon's journals have been lost, VOC records refer to the savage, cruel black barbarians he encountered. Unfortunately, it is not known what the Aborigines thought of the Dutch because they never had any journals to lose and nobody bothered to ask them, although their killing of 9 of Janszoon's crew might offer some clue. The Dutch, whether or not they started the violence, certainly knew how to dish it out. Jan Carstens, who visited Cape York in 1623, testified that the Aborigines have also knowledge of muskets, whose terrible effects they have learned in 1606 from the men of the Dufken who landed here. Another Dutchman, Dirk Hartog, discovered Western Australia in 1616. He landed the Unddracht on a big island in Shark Bay, spent 3 days finding nothing of interest, nailed a pewter plate to a post and buggered off back to Batavia. His countryman Willem de Vlaming visited the island 81 years later and took the Hartog plate, replacing it with another plate, confusingly also known as the Hartog plate. In 1801, the Frenchman Jacques-Félix Emmanuel Amelin came to see the famous plate and was so moved that he left his own plate behind. Louis de Freycinet, a less culturally sensitive French tourist, stole the second Hartog plate in 1818. You can see the first Hartog plate in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum and the second in the Western Australian Maritime Museum if you've got nothing better to do than look at old plates. Australia's western shores were soon clogged with Dutch seamen. Although VOC ships were ordered to turn left before hitting New Holland, they kept bumping into it because no one had worked out how to measure longitude at sea. And so the Dutch mapped much of Western and Southern Australia over the following decades. The first Dutch baby was born on Australian shores in 1626, and several Dutch babies were murdered there in 1629 by the psychopath Geronimus Cornelis. Cornelis, the pale and creepy second command of the VOC trader Batavia, had planned to steal his ship's cargo and mutiny against Francisco Pelsaer, his skipper. But before he could carry out his evil plan, the Batavia was wrecked on the Albrolhos Islands off the western Australian coast. When Pelsart set out for the East Indies in a longboat to arrange a rescue party, the survivors left behind made Cornelis their leader. This is what is known in history as a great big mistake. Cornelis believed his only chance of avoiding a mutiny trial was to kill any rescuers and make off in their ship with the Batavia's salvage cargo. For this he would need a band of loyal followers who would not give his plot away to the other survivors. It logically followed that there should be no other survivors to have the plot given away to. Before his eventual capture, Cornelis successfully slaughtered over 120 men, women, children and babies in a bloody orgy that makes Lord of the Flies look like Mary Poppins. He had his hands cut off before being hanged from a makeshift gallows. His last words were, "Revenge! Revenge!" except in Dutch. Several of Cornelis' enforcers met a similar fate, but 2 were left on the mainland as Australia's first permanent European settlers. The children of local Aboriginal tribes are still sometimes born with blonde hair. After all this excitement, New Holland had something of a bad name with the Dutch. They still occasionally visited. Abel Tasman formerly claimed Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, in 1642, a fact conveniently overlooked by British settlers a century and a half later. But they never stayed for long. Their attempts to sell pepper to the natives were met with confused smiles or rapidly hurled spears, and there was no European market for sand or poisonous animals, the only things Australia seemed to produce in any abundance. The only interesting thing about Warrnambool. Some respectable historians contend that the Portuguese sailor Cristóvão de Mendonça explored the east coast of Australia in 1522, and that there are maps and a Portuguese shipwreck somewhere near the Victorian town of Warrnambool to prove it. Others call members of the Portuguese school nasty names and have stopped inviting them around for faculty nibblies. The people of Warrnambool are thrilled by all the fuss, because it's the only time anyone has shown the remotest interest in them. The Portuguese discovery theory goes something like this. Mendonça led a Portuguese fleet to Eastern Australia, but didn't tell anyone about it. However, we know he discovered Australia because in the mid-1500s some French guys from Dieppe copied Portuguese maps and drew something that looks awfully like Eastern Australia, albeit if you've had a lot to drink and have never seen an atlas before. There's also a 16th century Portuguese caravel made from mahogany down in Warrnambool, and although we can't remember where we put it, we're sure it will turn up soon. The Dieppe maps were works of beauty intended for wealthy patrons, more art than science. French mapmakers were not overly concerned with accuracy and happily made up entire continents because they looked nice or because they couldn't draw any more ocean due to their blue pencil having gone missing. The Dieppe mapmakers regularly borrowed from folk tales to make their maps more interesting. The de Celliers map of 1550 clearly labels where one might find fabulous one-breasted Russian warrior women and the legendary Prester John, an Ethiopian Christian king who had access to the Fountain of Youth and a magic mirror in which he could view any part of the world. It is unknown how frequently Prester John used his magic mirror to spy on fabulous one-breasted Russian warrior women. Yet despite the unreliability of the Dieppe maps, some historians continue to pore over them. They alter the scale, make adjustments based on assumptions about longitudinal error, rotate a quarter of the map 90 degrees, do some folding that would put a master origamist to shame, and then declare that the maps clearly depict the Warrnambool coast. Applying the same techniques, they could easily have reconfigured Eastern Australia to look like Botswana or Great Aunt Mabel's wooden leg. As for the fabled mahogany ship, there have been no reported sightings since the 1880s, and earlier accounts vary wildly as to the ship's location, size and construction. 2 reputed pieces of the ship held by the National Library of Australia have since been identified as eucalyptus, a wood in scarce supply in 16th century Portugal. Chinese sailors with no junk. On 24 October 2003, President Hu Jintao of the People's Republic of China addressed a joint sitting of the Australian Parliament, opening with these words. Back in the 1420s, the expeditionary fleets of China's Ming dynasty reached Australian shores. For centuries, the Chinese sailed across vast seas and settled in what they called the southern land, or today's Australia. They brought Chinese culture here and lived harmoniously with the local people, contributing their proud share to Australia's economy, society, and its thriving pluralistic culture. President Hugh's words were inspired by the international publishing sensation of 2002, Gavin Menzies' 1421, The Year China Discovered the World, which has been translated into 20 languages and sold well over 1 million copies. Academics are, as a rule, bitter and twisted people who cope poorly when people without doctorates write bestsellers on their subjects of expertise. Professor Felipe Fernandez Armesto of the University of London offers this view of 1421. It is almost without exception wrong, factually wrong, and the conclusions drawn from it are logically fallacious. I mean, they are the drivel of a 2-year-old. To say that it is devoid of evidence, logic, scholarship and sense was just about the nicest thing one could say about it. Because, I mean, you've got to be either a charlatan or a cretin. You've got to be either, you know, a kind of con man or an innocent idiot in order to produce a book which is so lacking in any intelligence or accuracy whatever. Fernandez Armesto disputes Menzies' thesis that in 1421 Sheng Hai, a giant Chinese eunuch who kept his dismembered member in a jewelled temple so that it might accompany him into the afterlife, led a fleet of over 100 aircraft carrier-sized ships to explore every single continent, including Antarctica. Menzies contends that 2 of Sheng's equally genitally deficient admirals, Hong Bao and Xu Man, split from the main fleet and separately discovered Australia's west and east coasts. Menzies writes, "The most direct and persuasive evidence of the Chinese visits to Australia comes from Gympie. According to ancient Aboriginal traditions, a race of culture heroes sailed up this creek into Gympie's harbour in ships shaped like birds." He cites the eminent Australian historian Rex Gilroy, who discovered the Gympie Pyramid in 1975. Menzies is certain that Gilroy's pyramid was a Ming Dynasty observation platform used by Xu Man to monitor his extensive Queensland mining operations. He goes on to mount a uniquely compelling case that 90% of Xu's men died of radiation sickness after mining uranium in what is now Kakadu National Park. Menzies relies heavily on Gilroy's groundbreaking work on early Chinese visits to Australia, which were first reported in a 1987 edition of Australasian Post, a publication well known for photographically charting the history of Australia's topless women and exclusive stories on men who have 2 penises or wear swarms of bees for beards. Gilroy's other articles for the Post include Stonehenge is Here, February 1990, Space Aliens in Australia, September 1986, Our Own Nessie, May 1985, and the seminal Why Yowies a Fair Dinkum, August 1980. In just 16 short years, a story published in a barbershop wank mag, written by a conspiracy theorist who makes Oliver Stone and John Pilger look like Jemima Puddle Duck and Mrs. Tiggywinkle, would inspire the President of the People's Republic of China to claim centuries of Chinese settlement in Australia. History is often like that. The most ridiculous discovery theory of all. And amidst the buzzing static of the competing theories as to the discovery of Australia, you will hear whispers of a heresy so outrageous, so manifestly absurd, so contrary to good sense and common decency that it offends every notion of what it is to be Australian. It is the theory of the unoriginal non-inhabitants.